Hello and welcome to another episode of Man Buns and Jesus. I'm one of your hosts, Pastor Ben Olschlager from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church here in the lovely and relatively warm state of Michigan, at least today. We're supposed to get like a foot of snow tomorrow. Um, it's going to be great. Uh, with me today is the bewildered and somewhat deer in the headlights Preds fan known as Pastor Josh Laborious out in Eastvale, California. Well, technically, he's currently in Corona, right?
I am. I am.
Church is.
Also, we're not going to talk about hockey today. We're not going to do it. It's
Josh is in a
that's not
period.
what this day is about.
Josh is in a period of mourning, but that's okay. Um,
It did snow here yesterday, though. I mean, obviously none of it made it to the ground, but I looked out my window and there were snow flurries, and I thought, "That's it. This is the end. The end of time has reached us, and this is how it starts."
that's. I'm not surprised that that was your response to flurries. Did the city shut down too while they were at it?
Oh no, because
Okay.
I mean, by the time it hit the ground, it was water.
Okay.
So
Anyway, what are we
anyway,
talking today, Josh?
well, here's what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen. Um, we're going to kind of pick up on. We did a mini series, if you'll recall, a couple weeks ago, and we talked about sexuality and we talked about self defense coming, and that was coming out of um, some. I don't want to say issues, but for the sake of concise language, I'm going to say issues with the new large catechism that people had. And we thought we were done. We thought we were good until some more details came out about who had been driving a lot of those complaints, and it was kind of bad. It was kind of bad. The actors behind it were not really. I guess I shouldn't get assumed to know their motives, but they weren't theologically concerned so much as they were driven by different ideologies that they had. Um, some of which were definitely extremist ideologies with different political stances. Anyway, we're not here. We're not going to talk about them, but it kind of part of the response was a acknowledgement, a statement from our national church body, from our synodical president, that we reject racism as a synod, that we do believe racism is a sin. Um, so we thought it might be appropriate, if somewhat dangerous, for us to talk. And this has been a topic that's been on our list of potential topics for a while. And we thought, well, maybe we should just finally bite the bullet and break our teeth. So that's what we're going to be talking about today is racism. And before Ben kind of jumps in, I want to set some ground rules for you as a listener that I hope you will follow. The first is remember that we are a people of grace. It is entirely possible that over this next hour we say something that we shouldn't, or we say something in a way that maybe is less clear or something than we should. We apologize for that. We're gonna do our best. Our goal is to be faithful uh, to the confession that we share. So we ask that you take everything that follows with a measure of grace and do your best to put the best construction on this. Um, and listen to it for what it is, and that is we are reflecting on the realities we're facing in a theological light, in the light of our faith, um, and don't make what we say bigger than it is. And as necessary, we'll talk about maybe what I mean by that. So, with that, Ben wanted to get us started on kind of maybe some of our legacy as Lutherans when it comes to this kind of issue. And I don't know what he's going to say. So, Ben, please don't make me quit.
Uh, I think you'll be okay. Um,
I didn't mean the church. I meant the podcast. Like, don't make me walk
no,
out of the room.
I figured that that was the case, but either way. Um, so one thing that it's kind of important for us to remember as Lutherans is that there are some preconceived notions around Lutheranism that exist, um, mostly for a reason. Um, if you ask a person, who is a Lutheran, more often than not, they're going to tell you that it looks like Josh and I, usually somebody who is white, often with a German or Scandinavian heritage, some Eastern European as well. But
Which is that's where our denomination came
yeah,
from. So
it's
that
where
it
our
makes a lot
denomination
of sense.
certainly. Um, but that also factors into our history a little bit in terms of some of the things that Lutheranism has interacted with, um, some of the things that Lutheranism has been a part of, and that circles back even to Luther himself. I don't need to spend a ton of time on this because I'm guessing that a lot of our listeners are familiar with this.
Or
Um,
don't care.
I haven't even gotten to the point yet. The Middle
Well,
Ages,
you're setting up a discussion about Luther, which is historical theology.
that's fair.
So my assumption is someone's either familiar with it or they don't care to
Care.
be familiar with. Anyway,
That's
continue.
fair. Uh, it's yeah. Anyway, so the Middle Ages were not kind to outsiders in Europe. Um, Regardless of who you were, there were strong lines drawn at national borders, at linguistic borders, uh, on excuse me, on ethnic lines through communities. Some of that was due to church related policies. For example, there was a significant hatred of the Jews in the Middle Ages and the Reformation era. And that was mostly down to the fact that the church forbid anyone within the church from charging interest on a loan, which meant that the only people in a community that could do that were oftentimes the Jews. And so they became the bankers, they became wealthy, and that became a sore point for a lot of Christians in the Middle Ages. Um, there were literally crusades in the Middle Ages perpetrated by princes and kings against Jewish communities in Europe. Um, and there was a lot of atrocious violence and hatred that went on there. And Luther, in his day and time, fed into that. Um, for a good portion of his life, he wasn't necessarily um, feeding into that ideology too strongly. But towards the end of his life, he dealt with a lot of illness. And as his mind went, he started to become um, pretty racist, honestly, against the Jews. Um, and some of that ideology, some of that writing got taken up by various rulers in Europe throughout the years. Um, and I'm going to skip ahead here to the 1900s, when a particular guy named Adolf Hitler um, got a hold of some of those writings and began to use them to manipulate the church. Um, the the church in Germany was not necessarily distinctly Lutheran as Josh and I know it. People who observe and hold to the Book of Concord, the confessional document that Josh and I have to, uh, people who are at least nominally Lutheran. Um, and Hitler was able to take Luther's words on the Jews and use them to turn 90% of the church in Germany into a pretty racist and nationalist organization that helped perpetrate a lot of the crimes against the Jewish people in Germany and Eastern Europe throughout World War II. And that's just the European side of things. On the American side of things, um, our own denomination, the LCMS, had segregated seminaries into the 1900s. Um, there are portions of different Lutheran church bodies across the United States that uh, were very pro-slavery and fell into a lot of that ideology. Um, and there are, aspects of the very strong German heritage that a lot of Lutherans come from, um, that has become, whether we like it or not, attractive to certain strains of people in the country. Um, and so, is Lutheranism inherently racist? No. But does Lutheranism have a history that includes a fair amount of racism? Yes. Um, and as pastors in a denomination where that does exist, we have to ask ourselves, how do we interact with that history, and how does that influence or impact our ministry, especially as we try to reach communities that aren't necessarily the historic Lutheran base. And this is where I'm going to throw it back to Josh. Do you want to add anything to the history that I've just given, or note anything on that history before you jump in on some of those other questions and topics?
Um, I don't have a ton to add because, as Ben knows, and as many of my seminary colleagues know, I don't really. I'm not a history guy. I I struggle to care about historical theology, about even. And I know the line is, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. I'm pretty familiar with history, especially like compared to the average American, right? In high school, I wanted my grades, so I learned. Um, that does not mean I have at any point had a passion or really even an enjoyment for learning history. Um, but what I do want to point out to kind of keep us balanced, there were also voices in the Lutheran Church who spoke up for what was right.
Mm-hmm.
Right, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a really notable example, who spoke up against the Nazi regime during World War II, during their reign, and he spoke against it, and ultimately he lost his life for it. Um, but there are voices like that scattered through history, and like I said, not a history guy, so I can't give you any more names.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people who have faithfully spoken for what was right, even though uh, the people around them were advocating for, or at very least abdicating to people who were doing what is wrong. Um, and if you're sitting there, because I've had this struggle in my life, there is this question of, well, I didn't do any of those things. Why does it matter? And I think there is a strand of thought today that you can kind of be inherently racist, and I want to reject that. I think that uh, when we're talking about stuff like this, we should really measure people by their words and by their actions, uh, not by the color of their skin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's not to say that stuff doesn't matter, because perception matters.
Mm-hmm.
So if when you say when you go into a conversation and you say, "Oh, I'm Lutheran," you have to at least be aware of some of the connotations that other people are going to have with that. Um, Now, I will say, I think that that is diminishing quickly. How much meaning Lutheranism carries with it, uh, because I mean, as a society, I don't think there's as much appreciation for history as maybe there was previously.
Mhm.
Um, and there's also not as much instillment of like Christianity, because out here most of the people I come in contact with, if I say, "Oh, I'm Lutheran," their response is going to be, "What is that?" There's not familiarity there, because it's not really part of the greater culture out here. So like if you're one of my members and you're listening to this, you might not it's good to be aware, but you probably aren't going to have to contend with those presuppositions nearly as frequently, because most of the people you meet are going to have no idea what Lutheranism is. Um, you say Luther, and they're going to think Martin Luther King Jr., not Martin Luther. Uh, so, and
Maybe a way to summarize all of that is, as Lutherans, we're going to reckon with some of the scars that exist because of our church's history, even if we ourselves don't necessarily contribute to them actively.
yeah, so and so Ben and I were talking about doing this topic this morning. We were texting about it. I was in the gym. Well, I was on my way to the gym, and then when I was working out, I thought about this a lot. And what we want to do here is we want to make sure we keep this balanced, because there are, when it comes to discussions about race, I do genuinely believe there are chasms on either side of where we should be. Because on the one side, there are those who say, "Oh, we don't need to be concerned with racism at all. We don't need to have these conversations." And I don't think that's right, because the reality is we are called to love people
Mhm.
regardless of who they are, regardless of where they come from. And race is a part of some people's experience. So we have to engage with that. We have to recognize that. And we also, you got to make sure you're not doing racism, right? Like I genuinely, and I don't know that I actually have met anyone who personally who is genuinely racist. Uh,
I can,
Ben, the look on your face tells me that I might be wrong, but
no,
um,
I'm not saying somebody that you've met. But I mean, Josh and I went to seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, which finds itself at an interesting crossroads, kind of on the borderline between the North and the South, both historically, culturally, ideologically. And it also became a significant point of immigration in the wake of the Civil War and some of the Jim Crow laws and a lot of other things. And so there's been a fair amount of racial tension in the city of St. Louis. And it kind of persists to this day. You see things
right,
like there's a very famous kind of socioeconomic line called the Delmar Divide, where a specific street really pretty starkly contrasts the wealthier and poorer part of St. Louis, and it's also very racially divided along that line. Um, but I definitely ran into people during my time in St. Louis, some of them who were members of Lutheran churches in the area, who still had pretty racist ideologies. And I'm not going to chalk that up to them being racist. A lot of that, I'm sure, has to do with St. Louis being what it is in the grand scheme of history. But those things do exist, and we need to know how.
right. No, what I was saying is, because I'm sure I have met racist people, whatever. I was more saying I don't know anyone who personally,
Hmm.
like I don't have a serious relationship with anyone who uh,
Goes out of
has
their way to
ever
be racist.
right or has like has ever treated someone differently because of their race,
Hmm.
right? Um, so there's the one side. There are those who say we shouldn't talk about this at all, and I think that's a mistake. Um, if for no other reason than perception matters. So we have to deal with what a lot of people in the country perceive, how they perceive their world. Um, on the flip side, there are those who like want to see racism everywhere.
Hmm.
And this we did a podcast on critical theory, but I've been in an ethics class since then where we talked about critical theory, and part of the issue with critical theory, much like our episodes on conspiracy theory, is if you are looking in the negative space, right? If you're looking for stuff like by what is not there, you are never going to be done
Hmm.
because there will always be negative space.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is if you say, well, there is no, uh, I'm trying to think of a non threatening example here.
Can I throw a
Um,
history one at you?
maybe, yeah, go for it.
So, communist Russia, and I bring this up because a lot of the underlying theories behind critical theory are related to the same Marxist ideology that spawned communism. But in communist Russia, they were constantly trying to find ways to make people more equal. Um, and along the way, it oftentimes led to a lot of apathy. Um, and their ultimate like settling point in a lot of communities, there still was inequality. And so they still felt like there was more to be done, but ultimately their settling point was things still weren't great, but everybody was still kind of equal because so much apathy and indifference and um, kind of helplessness had set in those communities that like they just didn't know where else they could go, and that translates into some of the conversation around critical theory. Um, not vouching for everything that he's written since, but J.D. Vance, Hillbilly Elegy, the idea of learned helplessness, where people like the more excuses you give somebody as to why they can't achieve what they've been told they can achieve, the more they're going to undervalue themselves and underachieve. And critical theory plays into a lot of those things. Um,
Yeah. So those are our two extremes that we're trying to, because there is it's a conversation worth having, but you don't want to overcorrect on the for the chasm on the other side where
mhm,
everything is always about race.
mhm,
It is one facet of the human experience, and really, in the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty small one.
mhm,
Um, now, a couple things because you we brought it up, and because this has been a big part of the national discussion in our church body, is critical race theory (CRT) and Black Lives Matter, which typically they are brought up in the same conversation. Um, and I don't know if Ben's gonna track with me on this, so this might be a point of disagreement for us. But there was a point in our seminary career where there were some people who kind of made this argument for specifically for Black Lives Matter that you can, how do they put it? You can agree with the statement even though you take issue with the organization,
mhm,
right? And there it was this idea of there's this principle that we should value the Black lives, um, and you kind of ignore the organization that's behind the movement. And I have a lot of I think I've thought about it a fair bit. And I disagree pretty strongly with that. Because in the same way that we're having this conversation because the perception is out there, the organization and the movement are very closely interlinked. And I think no one is going to wait for you to explain where you are drawing the line of association, because Black Lives Matter, the organization, not the movement, the organization has their hands in some places that as Christians we would say you shouldn't have fingers in those pies. Um, and with critical race theory, I think it's because there are some who say, oh, this is a fine thing, they're just asking questions or whatever. But in the same way, it's very closely linked to a lot of things we would say as Christians we should probably keep away from those things. And when I step back and I look at some of the things that BLM and CRT have done in our society, or at least people have done in the names of these things, I think they are, in many cases, harming the groups that they're trying to support more than they are doing good. So when it comes to CRT, when it comes to BLM, I am understanding that, like, I, I'm not going to judge you harshly if you're like, oh, I support this or I'm on board with this. I'm going to have some questions for you because I want to know where you draw the line. But for me personally, I think that going about it in a different direction and kind of avoiding the pitfalls that come with those two specific things, uh, that's the route I'm going to go personally, is to approach this kind of stuff from a different direction. Um, because of all the other things that are entangled with CRT and with BLM and with some of the other things that are caught up in that conversation. Um, so
I think
yeah, what do we think, Ben?
I think regardless of whether or not you agree with the organization, the phrase is out there. And we're having to engage with it just as we're having to engage with the overall topic of racism. Um, and so on some level, I'm of the mindset that you can't avoid it, regardless of what you want.
I
And
I
so,
should clarify. I didn't mean, because you're right, it's out there. You have to deal with it. I meant avoid it as this is part of my ethic, or this is part of how, like, owning it. Avoid owning it as something that I subscribe to. Not avoid it entirely. That is impossible. Is that a helpful clarification, or did I just make things less clear? To
yeah,
to put it really crassly, I'm not putting that in my Twitter bio. I don't have a Twitter, but if I did, I would not be putting any of that in my
that's
Twitter
fair.
bio.
That's fair. And,
Is I'm not going to be preaching it. I'm not going to be teaching it from my position of authority as pastor,
mhm,
um, even though it's out there.
yeah, I think the thing that the movement has done for us in terms of the conversation around racism, um, and our responsibility to reckon with it, is that it's given us a phrase that is pretty hard to refute, right? Black Lives Matter. If you have problems with that phrase as a phrase, not all of the baggage that it brings, but just as a
Right.
phrase,
Those three words
those three
in
words
that order,
and their definition according to the
according to Merriam-Webster.
yeah, and the syntax of everything going on there. Um, you can't argue with the phrase Black Lives Matter. And we now have to, as a people, as a denomination, as a theological movement, go, okay, what does this mean to us and for us? How are we either advancing in our understanding of this or working against it? And I think um, that's where I fall. I think is less of even bothering to engage with, do I agree with the phrase? Do I agree with the movement? Whatever.
It starts a conversation.
It starts a conversation and it helps us consider where we're at. Um, I remember my fourth year of seminary. I lived half mile off of camp, or no, a mile off of campus. Not even. It was a half mile off of campus.
That distinction, that clarification really matters.
It does. I did not live far from campus. But every day, the as I walked to the seminary, um, there was a
Uphill both ways for anyone keeping track.
absolutely. It actually was uphill both ways, downhill both ways as well. But uh,
Physically impossible, good sir.
it was crowned in the middle. You went uphill from the seminary to
For anyone who's not watching the video, I rolled my eyes at him.
thanks, Josh.
Continue, Ben.
Um, but the one major intersection that I had to cross to get to the seminary, on there was one of those like short poles with the buttons for the crosswalk, and written in very large and obvious letters right underneath the button were the letters FBLM. And I will let people fill in the blanks there for themselves. I apologize for no parental warning on that before I gave it to you, but um, it's one thing to not agree with the movement. To me, it's another thing to write those four letters on a post, especially considering the state of that conversation in our country at that time. This was 2020. This was months after the George Floyd shooting in Minneapolis, and that whole summer of just very gray and questionable interactions, especially between law enforcement and members of the Black community. Um, and I think as we have that conversation, we just need to be prepared to have it in grace, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if you like the organization, doesn't matter if you want to use that phrase or not.
You
But
shouldn't be treating someone in a manner less like we are called to show love to our neighbor.
mhm,
Even if they're our enemy, we are to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us.
yeah,
Um, so no matter what your stance is, you are still called to love people of right. If someone comes up to me and they're like, I'm all about BLM, I'm gonna say, okay, I love you. I'll care for you. I'll pray with you. If someone comes up to me and said, I'm really fed up of this organization, like
mhm,
I'm sick of it, I'll be like, I love you. I'll care for you. I'll pray for it. I'll pray with you. Um, and I think, well, and even with that, I think part of the issue we're coming across, and and we need to be aware of this, is we as a society have gotten really, really good at understanding subtext.
we think
Like,
we're really good at understanding sub
well,
because
I should rephrase that. We're really good at reading subtext into
there
situations.
you go. Because the point that I was
So
trying to get,
someone says BLM, and we don't just understand Black Lives Matter. We also hear all of these other things that we have then associated with that word. So
yeah,
when if someone says to me FBLM, there's a clarifying question there of are you actually against the organization or are you really fed up with everything the organization has been connected with either in reality or in your mind?
and if you're a member of that organization and you see somebody write that on a post or say that to your face, right? Their immediate response is not going to be towards the background information around the organization, but they're going to think that it's an affront to the primary motive of that
Right.
organization, which is around racial reconciliation in relationship. Reconciliation is maybe not the right word, but it's around racial issues and relationships, right? And so if you're saying FBLM to somebody that cares about BLM,
They're
they're
going to take it poorly.
yes, they're going to read that as racism. And sometimes it might be, sometimes it might not be, but you don't necessarily get the courtesy of being able to find out what they think, and they don't necessarily want to give you the courtesy of giving you the opportunity to explain yourself.
Which, to both sides of this hypothetical interaction, stop it. You're called to be better. Right?
Preach.
We are called, on one side, to always put the best construction on things.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if I see someone, heck, if I see someone on a sign, the church I'm a pastor of is Edgewater Eastvale, and I see someone out there with a sign that says, "I hate Edgewater Eastvale." My response is to say, "Huh, I wonder what they're taking issue with." It is not to say, it is not to immediately flag them as an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I am called to put the best construction on their words. So that's one side. And the other side, we should understand when the people around us are touchy about stuff. And I'm not saying walk on eggshells, but it's not going to kill you to avoid the most touchy subject. It's like the same thing with PC culture, right? I went to Vanderbilt for 4 years. I know the rules, right? I know the PC rules. And on one level, it's like it can be a little frustrating. Like, what do you mean I can't say X, Y, or Z? But it's like if you know that word's gonna upset someone, why not choose another one?
Mm-hmm.
Like the English language is pretty darn big. You can find another adequate word, and honestly, you can probably find a more fun one,
I mean,
right? Like,
still in
uh, like there. So an example, there's a word that starts with R that like when I was growing up, it was used to like just you're calling your friend dumb. You're not supposed to use that word, especially in that context. Y'all, do you know how many fun ways there are to call someone dumb? Don't like if for no other reason than that. I have a personal dictionary on my phone for phrases I like to use a lot. Um, One of them is you must have ironed all the wrinkles off your brain. What a great way to call someone dumb. Like so on the one side,
straight
yeah,
smack
people
wagon.
need to put the best construction on everything, but on the other side, if you know that someone's going to be really upset by a word, pick another one. And everybody just needs to calm down. Everybody chill out. Things aren't so bad. Oh, I think that's my overarching reaction to this entire conversation. Everybody calm down, show some love to each other. We live in 21st century America. We're all doing pretty good. We're all doing just fine. Oh boy.
Yeah. I think to kind of wrap us up on one final topic here before we move into takeaways. um, as Josh mentioned at the beginning, we bring this up because many of the people who are the most vocally against the new Large Catechism from CPH had racist or nationalist, like ethno-nationalist ideologies. With
And this is worth clarifying. It's not they committed some small infraction and that makes them quote unquote racist. Like full on white
yeah,
supremacy kind of and professed ideology.
yeah,
This isn't like a casual you disagree with me so I'm going to call you racist. These are people who are like, "Yeah, I'm racist and I'm proud." No one take that soundbite. Please no one take that soundbite. Oh,
immediate regret. Immediate regret.
immediate regret.
um. Anyway, so as an acknowledgement of the fact that that is in existence in our synod, um, our synodical president did put out a letter saying we need to bring these people under church discipline. And I think this is maybe a good thing for us to finish on. If and when, as Christians, and especially as Lutherans, with our history, with the proclivity that some people have towards um, joining us because of the history of our denomination, um, if we run into people with these kinds of ideologies, we need to be prepared to bring church discipline, to
Which,
remind them that Paul has very um, succinctly described our relationships as Christians as neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, but one in Christ. And we are members of one body. The kinds of distinctions that we set on earth are pointless apart from the fact that they might have something to do with the diseases and medical conditions we'll face in life. Um, and as somebody pointed out to me recently, in the form of a meme, there is
that sounds like something I would do.
there's oftentimes 5 times more genetic diversity amongst a single tribe or troop of chimpanzees as there is across the entire human race. Um,
Oh wow,
yeah,
that's a heavy meme.
yeah,
Someone put some serious effort into that one.
yeah. Um, and so whatever differences we claim to see or do see, or whatever differences we claim to create, the reality is that they are nothing in the grand scheme of biodiversity and genetics across the world, and they are definitely nothing when it comes to how we are called to view one another in respect to the grace of Christ. Our denomination embraced that in a motion put forward in convention in 2019. The president of our denomination, President Harrison, confirmed that with his letter that he wrote in the wake of all of this. And Josh and I plan on living that out to the best of our abilities as sinners in need of God's grace. Um, and so, if you're challenged by this today, uh, I encourage you to remember those things, to remember our callings in Christ to Him and to our neighbors, uh, and to remember our membership in the one body that is Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I think that brings us to a place for takeaways. Yeah, yeah. I was trying to decide if there was anything else I wanted to say, but no, there's
You're
not.
welcome. You're welcome.
So I think my takeaway is what I was talking about earlier. Whenever we're interacting with this or any other subject that people are up in arms about, right? Because there's almost a new one every day. Treat each other, put the best construction on things. Seek to understand and show love and grace. Like that is how we are called to relate to one another.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you can go ahead and apply that to your relationship with your family, with your friends, with your coworkers, with strangers, with other church. Like that works for everybody, right? And the other thing I want to leave you with is another way to call your friend or family member dumb from my personal dictionary. You can say that they have a room temperature IQ. That's a fun way to call someone down. I kind of want to do a podcast all on fun ways to insult your friends.
Uh,
Oh man. Yeah. So what about you, Ben? What's your Oh, and you're a towel. That's another good one.
uh, anyway, I think I would say, as much as we would like to think otherwise, it's important for us to acknowledge that there are still people within the Lutheran Church, within the United States, within the world, who are struggling with the sin of racism. There are people in the world who are affected by the sin of racism. And it doesn't mean we need to be looking for it everywhere, but we still need to be able to see it when it exists and where it exists, um, and call it out for what it is. Um, and I think our willingness to do that in grace and love, um, both for those who have been hurt by it and by those perpetrating it, will benefit us a lot, as a church, as a denomination, um, as a society, even, as we move forward from this time and place. And my personal favorite is, you know how in an EKG, when they're measuring brain waves, it's supposed to have, um, your EKG reads like Kansas.
Oh, that's another good one.
You can add that to the list.
I might. I might. Um, if if you have questions or comments or concerns about this podcast, this might be one. Reach out to us personally.
Mhm.
Don't You don't necessarily want to do this online, but
And
we're here for you.
if we have sinned, we will repent on air, and
Yeah.
make known where we have sinned. Because Josh and I are sinners in need of God's grace, and we are, trying to do our best to help you guys get engaged in some of these difficult conversations.
I'm thinking about it through the lens of your faith rather than through all the other lenses that people are always shoving in our faces. Um, so, yeah, we
You
appreciate
don't
your
like
patience
taking
and your
pictures either.
grace. What?
You don't like taking pictures either. Shoving lenses in your face.
That was weak. That was
Thanks.
pretty weak, Ben.
Thanks.
So yeah, we appreciate your patience and your grace when we tackle stuff like this. I do have to be honest. This is the first podcast we've ever done where I was actually genuinely a little apprehensive about it because a lot can go wrong.
You have a
So we
great
hope
sense
it
of
was it was we
humor.
hope this was worth your time and that it was helpful and beneficial to you in some measure. If you think it would be helpful or beneficial to someone else, feel free to share it with them. And go ahead and send them a link to this podcast, which we hope you subscribe to. Please do subscribe on whatever your podcasting platform of choice is. That is Spotify, Pandora, um, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, TuneIn FM, etc. I get random emails that we've been added to other ones because they find the hyperlink and they add it to their catalog, whatever. Listen to it wherever you want. Subscribe on whatever your preference is. It gives us uh, some validation, some understanding that what we're doing is worth it. And we have a Facebook page. If you don't know us personally and you have questions or comments, or you want to suggest a topic, you want to suggest a guest host, you want to come on as a guest host. Uh, if you don't know us personally, you can reach out via the Facebook page. We do check it from time to time. We don't really follow it closely though, so like it if you want. I don't care. Um, Ben might care, but I don't care. I don't think Ben cares either.
I don't know the last time I was on our Facebook page.
Yeah.
It's been a
Yeah.
busy 2 weeks in the Oschlager household. household though. So um we're off next week, right?
We are off next week
Josh is going
because
somewhere else.
I will be on vacation. So with that, we'll talk to you guys in a couple weeks. Brothers and sisters, go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.